Thank you, Lucy, for the introduction. I'm Marion Whittam, the interim vice chair for the UTBA. And it's my pleasure this evening to present, as I do at every meeting, the Beekeepers calendar for Toronto and the GTA. This Beekeepers calendar is a guideline for beekeepers. And note that weather, climate change, your location, varroa mites, bee diseases, and pests, and even the breeds of bees you have will influence your beekeeping activities and may provide you with some unforeseen challenges. Our calendar,
your calendar's not open yet. You're
not open.
Yeah, your PowerPoint hasn't started yet.
Okay, 1 sec.
Yeah, just double click on that file.
There you go. Okay, hold on. Technical difficulties here. Okay. Okay, so yeah, can you see it now? Can anybody see it now?
Yep, we're all good now.
Okay, perfect. So note that weather changes, climate changes, your location, varroa mites, bee diseases, pests, and even the type of bees you have will influence beekeeping activities and may provide you with some unforeseen challenges. Our calendar is 24 pages calendar, contains information about the monthly tasks performed indoors and in the apiary and the climate data for Toronto and the GTA, flowers in bloom each month, as well as beautiful pictures of bees and bee yards. And in addition, the final page has a lot of references that you can use, including references to beekeeping videos, blogs, websites, and books. It is a very valuable resource, and I encourage you to try and obtain a copy. You can obtain a copy in the UTBA website, Beekeeping Resources section, and I've included the link into this presentation, and it can be downloaded free of charge. Or if you are a paid member, you are eligible to get a printed copy of the calendar sent to you. You just have to email the address here and include your mailing address with the request. So hopefully you can do that. The education resources for the presentation tonight, I always include those from OMAFRA, the best management practices for winter colonies in Ontario, where to buy bees and what you need to know. The Ontario Honeybee Resistance Program, just a very high level summary. We did have Graham last meeting, and he did an excellent job. But for those that didn't either attend the meeting or see the video, I thought I'd just do a quick recap on that. My beekeeper calendar will feature how can I tell my bees are doing, how they're doing over the winter, and also the OBA feeding guidelines in case you need to do some feeding in the future. The other thing that you remember is that Honeybee Research Center at the University of Guelph has over 80 YouTubes now that are very valuable resources for beekeepers, so keep that in mind. You can get those online at any time. And some hard copy books that I always use, Dewey Caron's Honeybee Biology, Story's Guide to Keeping Bees, and the Tech Transfer Pest Management brochure and manual. So a couple of things about courses. The Tech Transfer Center has advanced integrated pest management on February 21st from 9 to 4:30 in their Guelph area at Orchard Park Center. So see the LBA website for more details. It looks like a very interesting course. Also, the Honeybee Research Center has a introductory bee course, which is in April and May in person, and registration is open for that. And also a virtual course that starts in March. So again, consult the Honeybee Research website for more information. So with February, bees should be still in the cluster and don't open your hives. But here are some signs that if you go to your bee yard, you don't want to open those hives, but if you kind of take a look, you can listen for your bees, putting your ear to the top entrance. You can't hear it. You can tap a little bit on that hive and just see if there's any activity there. You can also use a stethoscope just on the side. Look for melted snow around the hives, means that has been some heat generated from that hive, which is a good sign. Look for speckles of bee excrement as they have cleansing flights, especially if the weather gets a bit warmer. They tend to go out and do a cleansing flight. And even dead bees at the hive, around the hive, is a good sign, because what that tends to indicate is the workers are strong enough to start to remove those dead bees. The other thing, just make sure that with our weather being so changeable, whether it's snow or rain, make sure those entrances are clear, that the wraps are still holding and not blocking the entrances, that the beehives are not sitting in puddles of water. You certainly don't want that happening and then having them drown. It's a difficult thing to try and move them, but it's just to see how they are. And make sure that you, what they call lift or heft the hive, to see how much weight they had. If you've taken notes during your fall close up, you kind of have an idea of how heavy they are. If they're starting to get light, then you need to think about some emergency feeding, and the OBA has guidelines for you. So take a look at those, and they do give you specifics about how to feed and what to feed. So the next thing is, Graham went from the ORBS program, did a wonderful presentation last month, but I thought I'd just give a quick recap about the ORBS program, because it's very important as we decide to order our bees and order our nukes. It is a collaboration between the Ontario Bee Breeders Association and our Tech Transfer Center. It's important that honeybees, they battle new threats all the time, pests and climate change, so you want to have strong bees. That program, the ORBS program, is world-renowned and is targeted at bee breeding that thrives, that makes them thrive, and focuses on specific inheritable traits to increase the adaptability of the various threats. And by buying queens through the ORBS program, you're supporting the idea of sustainable beekeeping. And there's lots more information on the ORBS site itself. A reminder about permits. When you're buying nukes or queens or used bee equipment, under the Bees Act, need to have a valid apiary permit for that's the bee breeder, to transfer ownership of honeybees for those who sell and even use bee equipment. And these permits help to protect the health and safety of the honeybee and prevent the spread of disease. So just a quick highlight about if they have a selling permit for queens and nukes, that bee yard must have not been positive for American foul brood for 2 years. It must not have had any European foul brood. There are no pest or disease orders in effect of it, and the average varroa mite meets the standard thresholds for criteria. And this permit is for selling bees, but not for used equipment. If you are selling used equipment, you have to have at the time of inspection, by AMAFRA, there should be no signs of disease present. For example, AFB or EFB, and equipment does not originate from a bee yard that has been positive within the last 2 years. So take a look at that on our OBA website about selling bees and how you buy them, and also the used equipment section. So what you need to know if you are buying a nuke. A nuke is just a nucleus colony of bees, and it's most common way to purchase bees for your hive. And the OBA standard is a 4-frame nuke with a queen bee, 2 frames of brood, half to 2/3 capped with adhering bees, 1 frame of adhering bees, 1 frame of foundation, and extra bees to ensure that brood is kept warm. Observations you need to know if you're going to that bee breeder, are the brood frames capped? 2 frames of mostly capped broods versus a frame of eggs and larvae will make a huge difference as to how quickly your nuke will grow. How old is that queen? Is the queen stock or imported? A nuke usually will have a mated queen from a previous summer, ideally selected from hygienic behavior, production, and bred locally. The bee producer asks them whether they have a formal breeding program. And many nuke producers mark their queens with the colors of the year in order to be able to identify what year they were produced. And you can see here, there's a color code: white for years 1 to 6, yellow for years 2 to 7, red for years 3 to 8, and green for years 4 to 9, and 5, and blue for 5 to 0. And there is a rhyme that helps you know that, and it's pretty simple. It's will you raise good bees, and that's it. So you can see in 2023, those queens that are marked will be red, will have a red marking on them. And the other questions, couple of other questions you ask, is it a spring nuke or is it a summer nuke? If it's a spring nuke, it's usually available in May or very early June, and it's had an overwintered queen. And the queen has proven to be a good layer and has survived that first winter. But a summer nuke is sold mid-June and after, and generally has a newly mated queen, possibly with brood from another hive. And the nuke may not be as strong to produce surplus honey for the first year, and don't expect any honey that year. And also, what is the cost of it? Costs vary. It can be $250 for nuke, depending on who your breeder, or that's just an approximate. Doesn't include a shipping box, or do you have to get that shipping box separate? So there's a great reference on the OBA website about where to buy bees and what you need to know. And that's all my presentation for this evening. We know that spring's going to be here soon. In fact, I think it's 41 days till March 21st. So there is hope. Winter will be going and spring will be coming. I hope everyone's quite well and starting to get excited about beekeeping for the spring. Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Marion. Okay, we're going to move on to our Be Educated section. Damian is a landscape ecologist, geospatial scientist, and a fifth year hobby beekeeper. He'll give a virtual tour of his 2 Ontario apiaries, one in rural Orangeville and one on a rooftop in downtown Toronto, comparing and contrasting his experiences with both and offering some observations between beekeeping in Ontario versus beekeeping in the Piedmont of North Carolina, where he started beekeeping in the spring of 2019. Welcome, Damian.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. What's my, by the way, what's the time I've got?
20 minutes to half an hour.
Yeah, I think I can do 20, 25 minutes for sure. So my talk is basically going to be not only my current setup, but also my growth as a beekeeper. Sorry, starting in 2019, it would be April 2019 in North Carolina up until now. I'll start with a basic introduction, who I am, what my background is, and how that relates to bees, beekeeping, and specifically honeybee forage and the ways that I think about beekeeping. This is contact information if you're interested. I teach in geography at UTBA Mississauga. I also teach in a Master's of Science program in Sustainability Management, which is the Institute for Management Innovation. Basically, I teach ecology, I teach landscape biogeography, which is how landscape and climate affects the distribution of living things on our planet. I teach GIS, geospatial analysis, computer mapping and analysis, and sustainability in general. My research is in agriculture, focusing on climate change in agriculture, as well as development of open source or free geospatial analysis tools. There's 2 emails here. Beekeeping stuff, generally, I say send here. If you want to talk about work, if you want to talk about research, feel free to use the university email. My cell is there. There's an Instagram account. I don't use it much. There's some pictures there if you want to look at them. It goes back to the early days of beekeeping if you're interested. That picture was me catching a swarm, I think in 21, when I was back visiting in the spring of 21. Apologies for my voice. The reason I'm not in person tonight is I have a cold. I feel like these days I just stay home with the slightest sniffle out of fear of offending people. So let's talk about how I got started. The guilty party for getting me started in beekeeping is this gentleman here, Bill, and his son Eric. Eric lived across the street from me. Eric and I spent a lot of time together talking about gardening, chickens, etc. Bees slightly. He said, my dad keeps bees and he's bringing me some top bar hives. Do you want one? And I said, sure, bring me one. Which is not necessarily the best way to get started. I had been reading casually about bees, but had not done any serious research. You all are aware of this phenomenon, right? Someone's kind of interested in bees, they get bees and they realize, oh no, I don't know if I know enough to have bees. Luckily, Bill was a phone call away. Eric had bees across the street. We kind of worked together. And that season, it was a pretty interesting season. I will say that I would not recommend starting off on top bar hives. I learned a lot. I think it's a difficult endeavor for two reasons. One, equipment is hard to come by. There was a garden shop, a couple miles, a few kilometers from my house. Very easy to get Langstroth equipment, difficult to get anything that worked with top bars. Furthermore, as you'll see in a couple slides, that there's a lot of management practice that's not really talked about when you go to beekeeping, specifically comb management. But, my son and I dove in. This is him putting a coat of shellac on this beehive. We had a great time that spring and summer watching those bees grow. He gave a talk to his preschool class that year about bees and beekeeping in his little bee suit. It was really an interesting adventure. But what started to happen towards July and August, and this is the dearth now in North Carolina. We don't see that kind of dearth here in Ontario. There's not much forage and the bees get crazy. But what you see here is the reason why I steer new beekeepers away from top bar hives. This is a cross-combed situation. So the ideal situation is a nice straight piece of comb on every bar. What I realized coming into midsummer was that I had about a 4 to 5 bar crossbar mangle of comb. Really, that was the brood chamber, which made inspections difficult, which made Varroa tests difficult. This is a first-year beekeeper, aware of Varroa, but not as diligent maybe as I should have been in testing, and it was difficult to actually test, right? It's hard to get in there and grab a sample if you've got this mangled massive comb. And I learned the hard way, because in October of 2019, those bees absconded and became a Varroa bomb for some poor beekeeper, right? So this is how I learned firsthand, well, this is something I need to focus on first before anything else. So, that was October of 2019. I was a sad racer with a bicycle, broke down by the side of the road, and everyone else continued racing in their beehives and beekeeping that season. Until 2 weeks later, late October, I got a call from a family friend who had bees living in the third floor soffit of his house. I was interested in cutting them out. I have a very healthy fear of heights and gravity. But for some reason, that didn't bother me, right? So we went and surveyed the scene, figured out where the bees were, went up there, took some pictures with an infrared camera, and planned for the cutout. I got assistance from Eric, the son of Bill, who sent me that top bar hive, or brought me that top bar hive. This was a huge colony that had been there for multiple years. I would say this is probably about close to 2 meters, probably 1.5 meters, 1 2/3. Lots of brood comb, lots of honey. All of that was cut out and put into medium boxes. That took us all day. And if you're interested, I'll send you this link. There's a full album here, but that took us all day to cut that out. We banded everything into medium frames. This is when I started to realize comb management is easier in frames than it is in bars. Eric and I succeeded that day. He got hit by a bee at the close of the day on the ground, which was very interesting. And actually, this was the season he stopped beekeeping. He realized he had a pretty severe reaction to bee stings. This was the last soiree for Eric into beekeeping. But that hive came home with me. It was a full medium box of brood comb, and up top, I put some banded in comb, and I fed back every drop of honey that I got from them. This was October, late season 2019. A lot of the older beekeepers in the Wake County Beekeepers Association of Raleigh were like, they're not going to survive. You're wasting your time. But what better, what else was I going to do, right? So I fed them all the honey, I fed them all the sugar water, and they made it through the winter. Now, winters there are short. Flowers are blooming now in Raleigh, North Carolina. They're coming out of the ground. Bees are starting to breed again. I've spoken with several people that are keeping bees and are noticed activity. They're noticing larvae. But so spring of 2020 now. This is early April of 2020, late March, early April of 2020. That hive swarmed 4 times, right? And as a young beekeeper, I realized, swarm management is a thing I need to pay attention to. But luckily, because we were all home, lockdown in Raleigh, North Carolina in April of 2020 meant it was spring, but we were at home, and I'm working at home, looking out into my backyard from my desk, watching these swarms happen. I caught all 4. There are pictures of 3 of them, all close to the ground, all easy to get. This was probably 7 feet off the ground. This was at, ground height. This was, I would say 5 feet off the ground, and there was one more. I caught all 4 of those made a split as well with a virgin queen. And I was in April and May and June of 2020 operating 4 Langstreth boxes, and I repopulated that top bar. I do like top bars. I think now, later in my beekeeping life, I would get another top bar, though I would not do so at an out yard. I would only do so where I could check on it pretty regularly, more like a hot, just a little casual hive in a yard. These colonies, when I moved to Toronto in it would have been July of 2020, several of them remain on site. A friend of mine is managing those hives. She's basically taken them over. I donated one to a school teacher who had a bee colony or had a beehive at her school, an elementary school. Donated one to her and gave one to a close friend from graduate school. So, I gave away some bees, left a friend with some bees, and that apiary is still there. I visit it when I go there. They are right now, it's getting ready for swarm season and talking about splits. But in July of 2020, I moved to Ontario. Obviously, I didn't bring my bees or any bee equipment with me and had to start from zero. This was the COVID swarm, us playing with bees. And I moved to Ontario and got reestablished. This is not what I started with. This is where I am now. And I'll show you pictures of both sites. And we can talk about kind of what I'm seeing at both sites and then kind of what my goals are for this coming season. Out in Orangeville, it's farmland, it's rural. It's about a 1.25 hour car ride on a good day. On a bad day, it can take much longer, as many of you know. Not a bad trip. My son and I go up there, listen to the radio, chat. But on a long day out in the field, it can be a long ride home if there's been accidents, on any of those roads back to Toronto. It's a fallow farm field, and I'll show you a picture from the sky here in a minute. Currently, I've got 6 colonies out there, deep. It's a mixture of deep and double deeps. There's one nuke that I'm trying to overwinter more as an experiment. Everything's sitting on cinder blocks, and I'm storing honey supers out there on site. Toronto, of course, it's dense urban. It's a 5-minute bike ride. I love it for that reason. It's a rooftop site associated with what's called the Sky Garden. It sits on Galbraith Hall. That garden predates my being up there. And I actually took over a couple colonies from someone who was a former beekeeper up there. Right now, there's one single deep up there. I'll talk about that when I get specifically to that site. Everything's sitting on pallets on a rooftop, and all extra equipment, honey supers, deeps for brood chambers, those are all sitting on site as well, stored, wrapped up where appropriate, etc. So this is the Orangeville site. This is the property where it sits. This is the neighboring property. It's actually got a runway on it. And this water feature is interesting, which I'll talk about in a moment. The beehives sit at the back of the property. I set them that far back because when I surveyed the site in February of 21, it was windy, very, very windy until you got towards that tree line, right? So, and it seemed like the most obvious place to put it. What's interesting about this site and the surrounding area is this is wetland. This is area that's been backfilled for farming. And in the winter, starting in about November, as photosynthesis shuts down, as evaporation slows down, this field floods. I don't drive back here in December, late season. I have a 4-wheel drive truck. It does fine, but I don't want to risk getting stuck out in the mud late in the day by myself. So I tend to walk down that runway late in the season because it gets very, very wet. When you go out there in the winter, this is basically an ice skating rink. This area drains through here, and this basically becomes a pond. You can see the remnants of it in the aerial. The hydrology, if you zoom out, you can see the fingers of the drainage. It's very interesting. Consequently, I don't worry about bees finding a water source out there. On site, this is essentially what it looks like. This is looking north from that tree line. This is later in the season, I think. I'm losing track of exactly when this was last year, but what you'll notice right away from this image, as well as subsequent images, there is a lot of forage proximate to this apiary as well as in neighboring fields. A lot of fallow fields, a lot of border, a lot of borders between properties that are wooded. For example, the fall is just goldenrod as far as the eye can see. Consequently, that apiary stinks in August, September. So this is essentially the setup that I've got out there. Like I said, there's 6 colonies. You can see in the image behind me kind of what it looks like going into winter. That large stack is all of the supers that are being stored, as well as a couple other things. I've got the nuke wrapped up in that bundle as well. And it started with one colony. It started with 2 colonies in 21. They grew throughout the season and did well. I had one that went queenless. You'll see here we're actually dumping that hive out onto the ground. That did make it through the 21-22 winter, and coming into last season, I made some splits with purchased queens, and did well growing throughout the season, as well as working with Michelle. We caught a couple swarms, and I made some splits, etc. So that colony, that site is growing pretty well. It's beautiful out there. I have all the room in the world to grow. The landowner asks for nothing but some honey in exchange. I had her son, who's about 6 now, in a suit in the hives. They love the hives back there. Her plans long term is to grow cut flowers out there. Though she's having some planning. She's got some planning to do relative to drainage, right? If you know anything about ag, you need something like drainage tiles in there to act as macropores and move that water off site when you're trying to grow early season and late season. And honestly, I don't know how cut flowers and flower bulbs are going to do with that saturated soil, but that's beyond me. As far as my concern out there is I have all the room I need to grow. You'll see later on, my goal is to get to about 12 or 15 hives this season with splits, both with purchased queens early on and then with queens with some walkaway splits or queen cells or whatever. This site is great. I have no problem with forage. The big problem is it's remote. You can see from these images, let me go back here. I've moved everything in my truck. Basically my truck is my storage shed. I live in an apartment, sorry, I'm trying to find this image with the truck in it. I live in an apartment in downtown Toronto. I have no room to store equipment. I'm right now in a 3rd floor attic. I've got some supers and stuff behind me. I was storing honey supers down in essentially the dining room, but those were goldenrod supers and they stunk. So the family voted that they should move, and they ended up out in the field. So that's the Orangeville site. I'll be there for the foreseeable future. The only thing that would make me leave is if I could find a situation that's got as much room with as friendly a landowner that is closer. The proximity is the biggest issue. Gas is expensive. Time is in short supply for all of us. So let's talk about this was, I think, late fall after I had just done some mite treatments. You see that hive on the right there was the one that got treated that afternoon. So this is Galbraith Hall. Huron and College essentially is where we are. This is the building. If you squint, you can see right here, you can see the garden, and the beehives are on that roof as well. The biggest issue here is access. I finally got keys. It took a year to negotiate keys that I could take with me. And even that needs to be renewed. It's university, right? You're not gonna win in that argument. Furthermore, getting up and down the stairs, right? You take the elevator to the 4th floor and then walk up a flight of stairs, which is not too bad, but carrying equipment is not ideal, right? So most of the stuff that's there was predated me. It's used equipment in fairly decent shape. I'm slowly replacing things. So rooftop beekeeping downtown sounds really attractive and fun, but there's a lot of negatives, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But access and forage has been at least my personal anecdotal experience. I can't speak quantitatively, but I can speak qualitatively with an N of 1. The biggest bonus is I ride my bike down there. I throw a smoker, whatever equipment I need on my bike, and I ride 5 minutes down the road, chain my bike up and walk up and keep these in the afternoon. So this is ideal. This is my preferred mode of travel. This is looking south. The beehives are behind me in this picture. You'll see this is a fairly large garden. This is early in the season in 2021, so not much is coming up. But the great thing is I pilfer this with blessing from the folks that run it. When I come up to keep bees, I grab basil, hot peppers, tomatoes, and go home and make dinner. Coming from the suburbs and having a large suburban garden, essentially at one point in my entire front yard, I have a small community garden plot here, and this kind of amends that. This is a fun addition. So that's looking south. The beehives are behind me there. These are the 3 beehives as they were when I took over. This is 2021. This is looking south. This is looking south now with the bee. Losing my sense of direction here. Oh yeah, this is me looking south from behind the garden. The beehives are actually right here. Excuse me. So much equipment on this roof. These are the beehives right here. Looking south with the garden in front of me. This is now looking south with the garden behind me. This equipment is as it stood when I took this site over. This would have been, early summer, late spring of 21. There was one dead out in 2 colonies there. I unwrapped them and managed them through the summer. What I noticed all through that summer was what seemed like a lack of forage. The bees were always light, not a lot of honey coming in. At the end of that season, I ended up combining those 2 hives and went into the winter of 21 into 22 with 1 colony that seemed pretty strong. It failed in about March, which is another lesson, right? I see this now on beekeeping forums all over the place. You don't count your chickens before April, right? Because March is a time where you may see colonies fail. Again, now this is looking the opposite. No, still looking towards the garden. The bee colonies are still in the same place. I haven't moved anything. The biggest downfall, other than the fact that you have roof access, you have to carry things up and down the roof, is that there's these ventilation pipes. This one actually vents a bathroom. It stinks. These sites are not ideal. They sound a lot of fun. They sound like a lot of fun, but it's. I would leave it, I think, were it not for the proximity. It's a great afternoon walk in the summer, morning walk in the late summer, right? In the heat of the summer, late evening walk to check on the bees. I miss having bees in my backyard. When I first started, they were in my backyard. I could go out anytime, sip tea, and watch the bees. So through those 2 seasons, now I pulled my first, in this past season, I pulled my first substantial honey harvest. I still speak in volume. I know everybody speaks in weight, but 25 gallons of honey is what I pulled out of Orangeville alone this season. And that was late season forage. It was mostly goldenrod. It crystallized very quickly. It stunk to high heaven. Folks really like it. This is, just an example jar. Again, I've got a whole series of photos for extraction. With big thanks to Michelle and Honey Where You Are, I did make use of her trailer and her equipment and her services this year. It's great. I tricked my neighborhood into helping with the honey extraction, and they loved it. I let them all fill up a jar, and they really like to see how that stuff was extracted. So, so where am I headed now into 2023? It's a long list. I won't read it word for word. Obviously, with what I've learned over the years, I have a real keen eye on early season swarm control. I'm going to get into those hives as early as I can, make splits when I can, look for any signs of swarming when I can. There is no bear fence out there. From what I understand, on the edges of bear country, all the neighbors say, oh, there's no bears out there, but there's bears out there. I think I'd like to get a bear fence up around the apiary early spring this year. If you notice from these pictures, all the hives are sitting on cinder blocks or pallets. That wet ground out there is an issue with hive stands. I had, coming out of the 21-22 winter, I got a call from the landowner that the hive had fallen over, the single hive that was overwintering there, and I assumed it was wind, because the apiary the runway next door has recorded winds as high as, I'll put it this way: his anemometer, his wind gauge, was blown off of his setup, which is big wind gusts. When I got out there, I realized it was because the ground was so super saturated that one of the cinder blocks had sunk. Luckily, the hive fell as one unit because it was wrapped still in the koozie through the winter, so I was able to right it, and that hive was fine. But I'm thinking about building some more substantial hive stands to set out there. The problem, of course, is space. As an urban beekeeper living in a small apartment, I have no place to build such things, right? So maybe I'll build them out in the field. Like I said, I'd like to grow that Orangeville apiary to 10 or 15 colonies with splits, early season mated queens, like, mid-season with queens of my own growth. The Toronto apiary, I'd like to see 3 to 5 colonies out there. Right now, there's one, seems to be doing well. I need to get out there and heft it and see how heavy it still is, but they were strong going into the winter. And I'd also like to pull in volunteers from the community in Toronto that are in. So this is, it's close. It's around the corner from where y'all are sitting on campus. In the summer when the days are longer, maybe we could stop up there before meetings, etc. There are volunteers that take care of that garden. I'd like to incorporate a couple volunteers to help take care of that apiary as well. It's funny, number 6. I am a environmental scientist. My day job is keeping accurate data sets, creating accurate data sets in the field. With beekeeping, which is still a hobby for me, I don't do it as diligently as I do for work. I keep notes, and I look back on those notes, but I think I'd like to start keeping data sets enough to do real analysis with long term. Just a higher temporal resolution, collect more variables, that sort of thing. I'm planning to harvest honey earlier and leave the goldenrod in the field. It's a pain to bring sugar syrup out to the field for a large number of bees. As many as you know, they're operating apiaries professionally. My plan is to harvest before the goldenrod, leave everything that they pull from goldenrod out there, and amend where I need to with some sugar syrup. Queen management in general is something I'm looking to get better at. A lot of it has to do with my vision. As many of you can relate, my ability to see close up is fading quickly as I hit my late 40s. I need better glasses, but also my son is out there with me often, and he is getting better at bee management as well. I am giving away most of my honey this year, mostly to make up for my talking at people about bees that are not beekeepers. And so I'm just giving away honey really as gifts. I made candles as well, gave those away at Christmas. I'm planning on putting some remote monitoring equipment out there, starting with the weather station, but potentially I tinker with Raspberry Pis. I write computer code for a living. So I'm thinking about putting some sensors in the hives as well, specifically temperature, so I can monitor through the winter remotely. We'll see how that goes. That's probably more like 2024. And that 11th bullet, research, is my grand plan to marry my research having to do with phenology, seasonal cycling, landscape ecology with honeybee and honeybee forage. At this point, I'm in the lit review phase. I've pulled a lot of articles that look at colony strength based on surrounding landscape composition, that is what's around the bees in their forage, radius. In order to do that effectively in the short term, I really would need to hook up with labs that have long-term data sets on colony health. I can easily go back in time. I can easily pull remotely sensed images to calculate landscape indices, but I just don't have the data, a deep data set on multi-site apiary hive health kind of stuff. So that's a pipe dream. And that's really it for my presentation. I think I kept that at a tight 25, I think. Any questions, comments? I don't proclaim to be an expert. I'd love to hear your feedback, thoughts, comments, and suggestions. Let me know if you have any. Sounds like no.
Damian, I'll just comment on the bee fence. I have my bees outside of Toronto in Castleton, and I was told, oh yeah, there aren't really bears around. And then my neighbor actually got a hive, and the very next week a bear got into the hive. So I bought my electric fence, and the bears never found my bees, which are only really a stone's throw away. But the bear goes to the bird feeder at my neighbor's, which was fairly close to his beehive. So anyway, I'm glad I have the fence now. But for 3 years, I was okay with that.
I think it's inevitable. I think it's I've been lucky so far, and I know I will not continue to be.
Yeah, I agree, Damian. The very first time you've come across your hives when they have been destroyed by a bear, you will really kick yourself for not getting that up and running. I have a portable fence from Margot Supplies, and it's a solar fence. I'm happy to show you the layout on it. But yeah, they're out there for sure. And I do watch the bears pace my fence. And so Sheila, they may have found your fence, but when they pace it and get zapped, they leave and they don't come back. I run a 3-jewel fence.
Okay. Yeah, good. Yeah, for 3 years I had nothing. So I got lucky for that time, but yeah. And I have solar also. I bought mine at Dancing Bees because it's right nearby.
Anybody else?
Damian, I think that once you have the parameters set up for your research project, you may find that all you have to do is just simply contact the TTP researchers through the OBA, and they will likely be able to connect you with all of the resources that you need. They're very good that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I going through this past year, that's been on my to-do list as a back burner project, and the deeper I get into beekeeping, the more motivated I am to kind of to change the trajectory of my research. These days, it's predominantly future climate scenarios and, you know, suitability of various cash crops, how well they're going to do, you know, in various climate futures. But as I get deeper and deeper into beekeeping, the more I'm daydreaming or reading about bees in the scientific literature rather than my main focus. Anybody else? If not, I'll mute myself and stay.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention one thing on the St. George campus. There's a group called U of T Bees.
Yeah.
You know about that group, because you might be able to get some volunteers from them.
I do know about that group. I've tried to contact them a few times. I've been in contact with them. It was just a relationship that didn't pan out for one reason or another. And so I'm basically operating solo in conjunction with the gardener at the Sky Garden in the engineering school.
I wanted to say thanks, Damian. I also keep bees on my roof, but I do it in my home, sort of in Midtown Toronto. And I tend to go up, well, I go up and down a ladder rather than stairs, which I also think is a little bit of a frustration. But at my day job, I work at Toronto Metropolitan University, and there are bees on top of our engineering building where our urban garden is, and it's a bit of a bigger setup for their garden, but I've had the opportunity to go up and see those bees. So
Yeah.
I think it's becoming more common that places are putting them up there for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And it is nice to talk with the volunteers in the garden about bees. You know, there have been folks that have expressed interest, but then the equipment is always an issue, right? Getting protective equipment and so on. But I think this year I'm going to try to make a more you know, energized effort to get a couple, you know, 2 or 3 people in those hives as that apiary grows.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It was fun. I had a really good time looking back through 4 years of pictures. There was more than I could have included.
Thanks, Damian. It was really nice to get back to seeing some of our members' apiaries again. So it's really good. Okay, our next speaker is Vicki, and please don't, I'm sorry if I butchered this, Vicki. Wojcik. Did I say that right?
That was great.
Okay, good. Vicki has been working to protect and promote pollinators with Pollinator Partnership since 2011. As director, she oversees P2 Canada's research and programs, keeping on top of new and emerging pollinator issues, and managing programs that include pollinator habitat, conservation, and landscape management assessments. Understanding and enhancing agro-ecosystems, land use and pesticide policy review, support for threatened and critical species, and ecosystem service assessments in Canada. Vicki's contributions to pollinator research and conservation include numerous peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, policy pieces, planting guides, and technical manuals. Welcome.
Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I just want to triple check on the time that's available for the presentation. I think I'll have to go a little high level through some of the content, but how much time do we have?
35 minutes to an hour.
Okay, then we're actually fantastic on time. So thank you for having me and for being interested in hearing this presentation. It was a good introduction. So I'm the director of Pollinator Partnership Canada. And as you heard, we do a lot of varied work relating to pollinators. So of course, we're very focused on bees because bees are one of the best pollinators out there, but our repertoire includes all pollinators, all insects, vertebrates, as well as the ecosystems that they support. And we do focus on a mix of sustainability and managed pollinator systems and conservation and wild pollinator systems, which gives us a unique position to kind of address this issue that comes up often about honeybees and wild bees. Are they competing? And so what I've done here is I've actually prepared a presentation that I'm giving again based on a literature review that myself and some colleagues put together to really try to put some science to the question about resource-based competition between honeybees and wild bees. It is a very hot button issue, but working in the space that we work in, we realize that a lot of these strong opinions that are on either side of the argument are not supported by data, and that the majority of the data actually lead us down a very equivocal path. So it's still a little hard to tease out the answer. But what I've done here, let me just get this perfect. What I've done in this presentation is we pulled out some of those pieces of research for you so that you can have a look at the data itself and understand why certain statements may be made. And then I'm happy to have a discussion afterwards. So, I don't need to really go into this level of detail for this group, but there is a potential for competitive interactions between managed bees and wild bees because they both look for pollen and nectar sources from flowers. So, but the same is also true for any species of wild bee. They're all in a landscape competing or using, I should say, pollen and nectar in their landscapes. But there is a challenge when we start looking at how do we maintain honeybee health and productivity, as well as wild bee sustainability. And one of the reasons is if you look at just the magnitude of the honeybee industry, so not necessarily speaking to hobbyist beekeepers, but more industrial production. Some of these numbers are a touch dated, but there's over 700,000 colonies of bees in Canada. The value that they provide to agriculture is 2.5 billion. If we look at just honey production, $173 million worth of honey, translating to 80 million pounds of honey. So this is a very large industry. With numbers this big, you can see that a lot of resources are required. And we want this industry to continue to be maintained because it pollinates our crops, but also provides us with a really good food commodity product. Then the flip side of it is the native wild bees. So upwards of 800, probably should adjust this number now to 900 wild species of bees in Canada. They have a variety of spatiotemporal patterns, meaning that, we just heard a really great talk about the cycle of bees throughout the year, or the beekeeping calendar. These bees all have their own calendars, and some of them are very, very short-lived and occur through just a few weeks at a certain time of year. Some of them have multiple generations throughout the year. And they are, when we look at wildflowers, native wildflowers and wildland systems, the key pollinators of those plants. Another thing about the wild bees in Canada is that we really don't know their status. So we don't know their conservation status. We don't know if they're doing just great or struggling for the vast majority of them. And that's just a factor of there being more than 800 species, and only a handful have really been assessed. We do know climate change has a huge impact on them, as it does on honeybees. Some species are doing better, which is, it sounds odd, but some species actually are taking advantage of the changes that are seen in a changing climate. Some there's no evidence for change, and some, not surprisingly, are doing worse. And then we do have a subset of listed species, and there's actually a few more now since I last put the slide together. But there's across Canada at least 5 to 6 species of listed bumblebees, and then the 2 cuckoo bumblebees, so the ones that are nest parasites on other bumblebees. But also of note is that wild pollinators, these native bees, many of them have been used in managed pollination systems. So there's a handful of bumblebees that are used as managed pollinators. There's also osmias of mason bees, leafcutter bees, and depending on where we are, nomia, which are alkali bees, are managed the same, not the same way honeybees are managed because their biology is different, but they are in fact managed for pollination. So if we're looking at what beekeepers like to do with their bees when they're pasturing bees, is they like natural landscapes with abundant, diverse floral sources. These landscapes are usually great because there's little to no chemical input, which can also be a challenge when you're looking for where to pasture your bees. But there's also a few alternatives for where you would put bees if you want to pasture them. And overcrowding is pretty common, especially if we're speaking on this context of more large-scale commercial beekeeping. So these landscapes are also the same ones where the wild bees are predominantly residing. And just what type of landscapes we're thinking of when I say natural landscapes or wildlands, forest lands, parklands, other public lands, often land trusts. They could be utility corridors, industrial lands, or private lands like a farm field that has had a beekeeping relationship for a long time with a beekeeper. So the concept of competition is really hard to examine. And I put that here first because, like I just said in my introduction, there's a lot of strong comments on either side of the argument of like, oh, honeybees have zero impact on wild bees, pasture them everywhere, to the flip side where it's like, no, one honeybee is too much. We can't have this in this landscape. It's really difficult to do an accurate study where the results will let you say, okay, we did see competition or we did not see competition. So that's one factor that we have to deal with. The other factor is when we look at the diversity of native wild bees out there, it's not surprising that there would be a diversity of responses. So when we do dive into the literature, we may see that in some cases, there is strong evidence of competition in certain species and in others, none. And as I mentioned before, many studies, if you just read the abstract, which unfortunately, I think a lot of people do fall into that, and then, start making your claims about that. When we actually go through the entire piece of research, we find that they make really strong claims about patterns of occurrence of bees at a floral resource. And we do know from even some of these same studies that foraging patterns don't universally correlate with survival and productivity and fitness. So there's a lot of research out there that makes the claim that when we put honeybees near these wild bees, we physically saw less wild bees on the flowers we were observing. Therefore, there's competition. But we know that if you follow up on the actual true indicators of competition, they don't always correlate with that. So just to be a little more specific and clear about what we looked at in this literature review is we looked at the presence of two types of competition, either interference competition, which would be a direct physical contact with another animal, so one bee pushing another bee off a flower perhaps, and then exploitative competition, which would be arriving at a resource or using the resource prior to another bee. And both do exist, but exploitative is more common. And it's the one when you hear people say, oh, there's this worry about competition between wild bees and honeybees. That's what they're worried about, the exploitative competition for the most part. And I just will put into context here that, not surprisingly, there is a competitive advantage theoretically that managed honeybees have. I mean, they have other issues that they're dealing with, but they are a species that's actively managed, so they can be protected or somewhat helped by us humans, whereas wild bees don't have that extra bit of help coming to them. And then a factor that you hear a lot, which I think is a little bit up for debate too when you jump into the literature, is that because they're recruitment foragers with very large colonies and that they're generalists, that they have like an inherent competitive advantage, which I think could be true, but again, is not a universal truth across all landscapes. So the other question is, there's a whole diversity of wild bees. So where do we actually see the highest likelihood of competition? And there's two competing theories. And again, they could both be true, right? But one of them is that if you have a specialized forager, which is one that if we want to use some of the jargon in wild bee, native bee language, it's oligolectic or mesolectic, meaning bees that forage on one or a few, genera of plants. So their foraging range is more narrow. Well, those species would be more susceptible because they have a narrow niche space and they are not able to shift. But then the flip side would be, well, maybe the polylectic feeders, which is the ones that feed on a large variety of different plants, would actually be the most susceptible to competition because they're the ones that would have the most complete overlap with honeybees. Honeybees are polylectic feeders. So an example would be that bumblebees, specifically ones with a medium tongue length, which behave very similarly to honeybees in terms of flower choice, they would actually be the ones most susceptible to competition because all of the resources that they have are potentially shared with honeybees. So just a quick overview of what we actually did for this study is we did a pretty extensive database search, as well as peer solicitation of research articles that might be in the thesis publications that don't make it into some of the search engines. And we ended up with 78 published papers that match the criteria of claiming to be studies on bee competition. And then we screened them a bit further for ones that had an experimental design, because as I mentioned before, there's a lot of field observations of patterns on flowers and then correlations kind of generated from that where there wasn't any experimental manipulation. So it's really hard to pull out an accurate response from those. We ended up with 19 studies. So that's not a very large body of research. That's the first thing I would say. And the results of these studies, when we read through them and looked at their data, in addition to what their results said, we had a more critical eye on their data because sometimes, again, an author using their right to interpret would say, oh, absolutely, there was competition. But if you actually look at the data, there wasn't. 10 of these 19 indicated that there was either no response or they were inconclusive. Now, 9 of the 19, so about 50%, indicated that exploitative competition was present and that the negative outcome was for the native bees. So when we did have studies that indicated there was competition, there was none that indicated the opposite, where native bees outcompete honeybees. So fair point there. And then 5 of those 9 studies actually went a step further and looked at reproductive outputs. And I think these are the ones that we should pay the most attention to because they really do truly tell us not only about competition at one point in time, but if there's an impact on the species' ability to reproduce, grow, make more bees. Perfect. So now back to that one question, is it the specialists or the generalists that tended to be more susceptible to competition? Actually, both. There was evidence in both groups that competition can happen. There were 11 studies that looked at specialized bees, and 4 of those studies found that there was competition. Similarly, there were 9 studies that looked at generalist species of bees, and 5 of those studies found competition. And now I just want to take some time to go over some of the results that were in these papers, because I think this is what's really interesting, and I'll keep it high level. And keep in mind that I am presenting someone else's research in these cases now. So you can always go back to the original citation if you have questions about it. but it's nice to see what kind of data we were shown or was being shown, and then correlated with, oh, there is competition or there is not competition. So, for example, one of the studies that did not find any competition was a multi-year study of honeybee foragers and bumblebee foragers in a landscape that had varied resources over time. And both the honeybees and the bumblebees were placed at the location. So this was a manipulative experiment where, while wild bumblebees were present, managed versions of the bumblebees were placed at a site, and both the density of honeybee hives and bumblebee hives was manipulated. And basically, through time, so the natural factor was just the natural resource variation in the landscape. In really only one of their sample years did they find a strong, significant correlation with there being less bumblebees when there were more honeybees. So they basically didn't find that relationship in this particular study when they artificially increased the number of honeybees present at a location and looked at what impact that made on the bumblebees that were foraging on flowers. Another study that, again, concluded that they did not find any competition was, again, a manipulative study where honeybee hives were placed in areas where there were native bees. Now, what they did find overall was that honeybees, the presence of honeybees did decrease the average visitation rate of all native bees if you lump them together. But then when they examined the flowers, the specific impacts on categories of native bees, they found that it wasn't all of the groups that were being impacted. Some actually had no impact when honeybees were present. So their conclusion was that it's a little bit equivocal, and they needed to do more work to really isolate if there are certain groups that are more susceptible to the presence of honeybees, making them shift resources. Yet another one that did not claim to find competition was a study done by Whittam and Mehmet in 2005, and they looked at how bumblebee forager abundance changed or didn't change as you increased the presence of honeybees, and they studied a variety of floral resources. So they basically had a landscape where they added honeybee hives, and they targeted specific floral resources that they knew were used by both honeybees and bumblebees. And they wanted to see if, as you increase the number of honeybees foraging in that system, if there was a decrease in the bumblebees using the shared resources. And they did not find any directional pattern here. When you increased honeybee abundance, you basically got no change in bumblebees. So now, looking at some of those studies that we reviewed that actually did conclude that there was competition. And I will say that these ones are the ones where they did a follow-up of fitness indicators, like reproductive indicators. So Thompson, who I presented you another piece just a while back, that where Thompson didn't find any competition, looking just at flowers and patterns. When she looked at the actual reproduction of bumblebee colonies in the presence of honeybees, what she found was that less males were produced and less reproductive females were produced throughout the season when those colonies were closer to the introduced honeybee colonies. So it basically did indicate that when this is from the same piece of research, when you look at a flower, you didn't see any difference in foraging, but if you looked at what the colony was doing after the fact with those resources that came in, they were producing less reproductives. Another study, this one was done in the UK, and I should say that literature review looked across the world, so not just in areas such as North America, or I should say outside of Europe, where honeybees are considered non-native, and then there's like an additional component to the argument of why there might be competition. So Goulson and Sparrow did this study in Europe, and what they actually did was they measured the size of bumblebee workers in a variety of species in natural landscapes that had a mix of honeybee pasturing by beekeepers, as well as ones that did not have any pastured honeybees. And they did find that there was a significant difference in key morphological characteristics, like the size of width of head, width of tarses, that bumblebees were physically smaller when they were in a landscape with honeybees being present. And so this was an indicator that resource access is limited because they're not growing as much, they're not eating as much. Another one that did a similar study was looking at the weight gain of colonies, so the total weight gain of bumblebee colonies, which would be both bumblebees don't store honey quite in the same way that honeybees do, but they do store some. But the weight gain of a bumblebee colony would be a good representation of how much brood they're producing. And in this study, similarly, when bumblebee colonies were close to honeybee hives versus further from them, there was a marked difference in their weight gain, and they did also produce fewer and smaller queens. So an indicator here that, that again, the interaction in the landscape with honeybees did have, at least on the fitness outcome, an impact. And the last two I'm presenting are not bumblebees, but actually other wild bee species. So this is a study from Australia looking at Hylaeus, which is a yellow-faced bee in agricultural landscapes. And what this study looked at was actual tube nest. So Hylaeus nests in a tube. It looked at the number of cells produced in a tube nest by Hylaeus species when they were in an agricultural field that had honeybee presence versus one that didn't. And they did find that at the sites that had the honeybees in them, there was 23% less nest output by the Hylaeus species. So again, an indicator that there was less reproduction. And finally, this is it's an interesting one. It's a little bit, it's a good methodology because it's a very controlled study, but the extent to which it actually represents any natural landscape that we would find ourselves in as a beekeeper or someone interested in wild bee conservation, it's a little off. So this is a caged experiment. So it created an artificial resource limitation. And I do say that because the concept of floral resource limitation, at least in an abundant wildland system, so very different than when we're talking about an urban setting like Toronto, where truthfully there are limited patches of good forage for bees, right? But when we're talking about a wildland situation, I would say most bee biologists don't think that floral resources are ever limited. It doesn't make evolutionary sense from the perspective of the plant, but anyway. So this was a cage study that artificially limited the resource and then looked at increasing the density of honeybees in that limited resource and what that impact had on the reproduction of a mason bee, the red mason bee. And not surprisingly, I would say in this case, when you really increased the number of honeybees foraging on this limiting resource, you saw a marked decline in the output, the reproductive output of the mason bees. So yes, the study did find that there was absolutely competition. I just think it's not necessarily representative of any real world scenario, but it is a really cool way to say, yeah, when you limit your resource, you absolutely do end up in that situation. Whew. Okay, that was a bit of a mouthful on what's out there so far. But then the question is, what can we say, or what can the science say, maybe even recommend when we get into these decision-making scenarios, like, should we allow honeybees in this landscape, or should you allow beekeeping in this scenario? So we know that both hypotheses, like either generalist or specialist foragers being impacted, can be correct at times. It's really difficult to make a universal statement because of the diversity of wild bee lifestyles. The results, even from the studies that were well done, experimental studies, are equivocal, 50-50. Although I will note that when fitness was assessed, like the number of brood produced or queen production, more consistently competition was able to be seen. But some of the recommendations that we would come out with this is not pasturing honeybees in landscapes that have sensitive or species at risk, which I think is just a very good beekeeping practice, especially at the time of colony reproduction for those species at risk, bumblebees, for example. And kind of like everyone's favorite recommendation, more research to fill the gaps. And I don't mean to be silly about that, but truthfully, there were only about 5 studies that really targeted reproductive output. And the more of those studies we do, we can get a better read on if there is an impact. But other kind of gaps and good questions that come up from this are, I just mentioned this before, are floral resources ever truly limited? So in a wildland situation, I really feel that no, that's not the case. There's a lot of work looking at if you could do a carrying capacity. There was some work in 2016 done by Jim Kane and Vince Tempedillo, where they looked at, they used a rangeland stocking model for cattle and compared that to bees, and they came up with a 5-unit monthly. So 1 honeybee hive per month in their research, and they focused just on one species, Megachile rotundata, was equivalent to 33,000 Megachile bees. So just kind of trying to gauge the impact of what one hive might be. My mention already that we should look at the reproductive output of many more species. Only 20 were actually studied. And then lastly, the last point I'll make is that even the studies that found that there was competition looked at it in a very short time frame. So none of these studies lasted long enough. I mean, it's probably an artifact of how funding schedules work and grad students come and go, et cetera. But most of the studies were a year, maybe 2, but often less. And none of them looked at population level trends over time. So, over a decade, if there were honeybees in this landscape, do we see continued decreased reproductive output in the wild bee species of interest, to the point that we now know that the population level is going down? None of the studies have done that. And I would just say it's fair to be skeptical that if there's a reduced reproductive output, that universally means that there's potential harm being done to the success of the species, because we do know that insects, the reproductive strategy of insects is to overproduce progeny because they're living in very unstable environments. They're often everyone's food. So if you are making 20% less, we actually don't know if that's a bad thing, or if you were already making 3 times more than you needed because the survival likelihood was so much lower. So there's quite a few unknowns still. That's just my last slide, the shot of the paper if you'd want to read it yourself. And I'm going to stop sharing because then I can see everyone, and I'd love to answer questions or have a chat if anyone has any questions, if we still have time.
Damian, you had a question in the chat there. Do you want to address that?
Oh, that was actually answered. I was looking at some of those plots and I was wondering about what you basically said none of them were correlated. It was, I can't really remember now what those plots were, but I do have a different question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned that generally in natural habitats, you don't imagine that there's an issue with limited forage potential. But as we look at fragmented landscapes, as we think about future scenarios, is that something that you're seeing in your little view, where there's just where various kinds of landscapes may in fact run into a limit on forage potential? Right,
and that's actually a good point to say. So the main comment, the suggestion that resource limitation is unlikely. Again, that's a bit of a generalization, and it speaks a lot to just some of the conversations we've had with just wild bee biologists, where what they see in landscapes is that most flowers, when they've done studies like pollen production throughout the day or nectar production, there does seem to be overproduction from the plant's perspective. So I guess, yes, if we frame it that way, it doesn't make evolutionary sense as a plant to limit the amount of resource you're producing, because you'd put yourself at a disadvantage. But to your point, like specialized and fragmented landscapes absolutely would be behaving potentially differently, especially with climate change. And the studies that were Diane Thompson's, I presented 2 of them. She's done quite a bit more work. She worked in the California chaparral, which, in addition to being a unique landscape that is quite sensitive to climate, its own resource availability is very seasonal. It's a Mediterranean landscape that fluctuates. So yes, that one does have dearths in production as well. So yeah, just to clarify that, that's where that generalization comes from. And it's kind of a rebuttal to this concept of, well, there's only so much food to go around, so you can't be putting honeybees here, when that's actually not true. Most plants really make a lot of nectar and pollen because they want all those bees to come and visit and pollinate. Yeah.
I mean, the last thought I had was more, as phenologies change and potentially these insects aren't catching up evolutionarily, would that issue then become more relevant in that model? I don't have an answer. It's just something I'm curious about. But thank you very much.
And I think it's a good question, and I think it's going to be true for certain systems. But I would say that if we look at the politics that drive this discussion, those landscapes where we have more large-scale commercial beekeepers seeking access to good forage, right? Those ones are still going to be good forage, because we're not going to have some commercial beekeeper try to go high alpine on some logging roads. No, so I think realistically, the landscapes where there's conflict between, you know, should a land managing organization limit or restrict honeybee access and beekeepers wanting the access, they're usually quite abundant, or at least they have been from where the space we've been working in.
Thank you.
No problem. I see a question in the chat that I can answer. And so thanks, Michelle. I really appreciate that question about, you know, adding habitat and adding forage to mitigate some of these effects. And that's one of the recommendations that we had when we actually did a summary piece like this. Our US sister organization, Pollinator Partnership, I used to work for their San Francisco office. we had a special meeting with the USDA a long time ago. It was like 2008. And the suggestion was really that a lot of this conversation and this dialogue could be mediated by more active production of forage resources, not in natural landscapes, but in managed landscapes like agriculture and roadsides. And actually, if anyone's familiar with the 2015 Pollinator Action Plan that came out of the Obama administration, that was another area where we had some interface with them of what these targeted goals would be. And one of their main goals was to increase foraging opportunities for honeybees and wild bees in managed landscapes. So yes, it is definitely a solution, I believe. Yep.
Luke has his hand up.
Yes.
Go ahead, Luke.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for the great presentation. Yeah, so I'm a little curious about Pollinator Partnership as an organization and how they choose to focus on different pollination issues and like, you know, spread education about it. Like, is there any work being done right now on pesticide use, particularly the ones that, you know, there is a lot of, you know, peer-reviewed science on, such as systemic pesticides that are banned in other countries. Now, like, there's a lot of work that was put into this kind of, we don't know currently, science between competition, although, you know, my understanding through your presentation, through the other work, is that it's really location based on competition. But for systemic pesticides, we know like none of that is good for bees or for other pollinators. So what is Pollinator Partnership doing with that?
Right. So in that space, back in, I have to do a little bit of math, back in 2012 or so, we actually did have a large scale research study that we administered in partnership with 5 different universities, where it was at the time, so 2012, you know, we've gone back almost more than a decade, looking at the impacts of the movement of neonicotinoids in treated seeds through the soil and through the air. So we definitely did participate in some of the active research to map the impact of these. And subsequent to that, you know, we weren't the only player in that. So now, at least if we look at the Canadian example, the review and restriction of a lot of the neonicotinoids has already gone through or is in the review process at PMRA, which is the Pesticide Management and Regulatory Agency of Canada. And they do it, I mean, there's a lot of things that can trigger them to do a review. One actually being something that no one can really take credit for, but every 8 years or so, regardless, you could request any registered pesticide to be reviewed because there's just been enough time that more information could be known. So there's that kind of active space. But right now, the most current thing that we're doing in the pesticide arena is that we're working again now with PMRA on the production of best management guides for farmers that are crop specific. So what they do is they outline best practice and risk mitigation to ensure pollinator health with the registered products for use in that specific crop. And they actually do go as far, you can find them on our website, they do go as far as to rank and list the products that, so all of these products are registered and legal to use. You could pick whichever one.
Unfortunately,
right?
Unfortunately.
But they go and rank, these guides rank them with the ones that are not a good idea, like red, like do not use this. You can, because it is legal, but it has adverse effects on pollinators. And here's your alternative. So again, it's basically kind of playing into the integrative pest management space, where we want to shift behaviors as much as possible to well, cultural controls, other types of controls. And if you are using pesticides, selecting ones that have the least risk to pollinators. And these guides also focus on evidence-based risk assessment to non-honeybee pollinators, because that's another issue too, that a lot of the data on pesticides is tested specifically on colony level impacts on honeybees, which is not the same as the way the rest of the diversity of solitary pollinators experience them.
Of course, yeah, these pesticides have a bigger impact on those.
Yeah.
So basically there's nothing being done in terms of trying to get a better, trying to get these off the shelf, right? Like farmers do what they're told. Essentially, they also
Right. Well, we're not an
they
activist
buy
organization.
what's available.
We don't
Right, like a
actively
lot of these
campaign.
seeds are already coded, right? And that ban that the PMRA put in place, we actually saw an increased use of systemic pesticides. So that like the evidence is really clear that these systemics are bad, and like you said that there was some work with soil and air. Was obviously the studies on water is pretty significant as well.
Mhm.
So like PMRA, you know, we can have a whole discussion on PMRA and the problems there, but you know, I ask this because a major part of your funding comes from these companies that are producing these chemicals.
That's not true,
And-
actually. We don't get funding from them at the moment.
Oh, you don't? Okay. All right. Well,
I mean, we
maybe.
sometimes do get funding from agrochemical companies to work in the space and do outreach and education, but
Okay. That's
we're
those are two
very
different
primarily
answers.
funded by donations and government grants and foundation grants.
All right. Well, it's listed as your sponsor, but like that's been part of the issue, especially for your American, Pollinator Partnership company as well. So, you know, that's my concern, is that we have very clear evidence about this, and you know, Pollinator Partnership could clearly say, hey, let's follow these other countries, let's ban these chemicals. Hey, PMRA, let's not try to like suggest something to the farmers. Let's clear off these super lethal ones to all pollinators off the market, right? I mean, they're developing new ones, and there's going to be some new bad ones, but obviously we know that the mode of how these are applied is the problem, right? The Health Canada banned these, like said they weren't going to approve the systemics because of the risk to the environment. Of course, they eventually approved it, but you know, like I really would wish, like, this education is great, but we've got education that needs to be shared, and Pollinator Partnership is big enough to actually, you know, you say you're working with PMRA, well, tell them to ban these chemicals. Like, beekeepers have been screaming this for years, and obviously there's been a very big political debacle about it, and I don't frankly like that at all. It has been damaging to beekeepers and farmers alike. But you know, this is an organization that's supposed to be standing up for pollinators. Seems like a really easy one to shoot for, right? It's so impactful, obviously not just to honeybees, but even more so to, you know, native pollinators, butterflies, birds, all these other species. And, you know, I just feel like for the American company that's like a little bit more aligned with the agrochemical companies, you know, I can kind of see why. But for this Canadian subsidiary, like, why not, you know, why not talk about that? The research is there. You can pull all the research papers, do the same kind of presentation to the PMRA, and like propose for banning these chemicals outright.
No, it is a little more complicated than that. And our approach really focuses more on integrative pest management as a direction. And we do absolutely, especially in the home gardener and agriculture space advocate for less chemical use. Is the best I can say. It's a complicated, very lots of moving parts and complicated path to go down.
Yeah, the science seems pretty straightforward.
Hopefully moving forward, we can get some more information from various sources, maybe pollinator.org being one of them. Can you please answer the Fran's question? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes. If I remember it correctly, Fran, in email, happy to be able to read it out.
Yeah.
Lucy, can you mute one of yourselves?
Okay, sorry, I found it. So Fran asked the question that while she didn't know exactly what the presentation was going to be about, she was curious about forage and nutrition, going beyond just food, and her particular interest in self-medication, social medication in bees, phytochemicals, lactobacilli found in the environment, and what could be done in a landscape to for both wild bees, native bees, and honeybees to reduce the risk of pathogen spillover in this context. So again, that is not my my area of strength in this particular case, but what we have seen a lot in the research and just in recommendations is the diversity of habitat, so diversity of food sources, really giving bees the opportunity to compile a diet that works for them. And there's, again, this is hard to very accurately study again, but I remember a colleague of mine from graduate school that did something similar, and there's quite a bit of research on bee nutritional composition coming out of the Tucson Bee Lab in Arizona, where when given the opportunity with a variety of floral resources, it does appear that bees can make choices to create a diet that improves their health if there's a limitation. So they'll change the composition of what they're foraging for. And yeah, so there is that information out there. I'm not the best person to ask questions on that one, but I would recommend, if it's a topic of interest, to look at some of the research of Gloria DeGrande Hoffman at the Tucson Bee Lab, because she's for decades been doing nutritional work. Primarily, it started on looking at synthetic bee diets, and if the bee diet itself is equivalent to wild source food, and then kind of spilling over into these other ideas of, can bees dictate their own diet if they have the full grocery store available to them? So she'd be a good researcher to look up.
I have a question for you, because I noticed, like in my backyard, when I had my hives, and then I used to go out every day and watch for what bees were on my plants, and very rarely did I see honeybees in my garden. It was all native bees.
Yeah.
And so, like, for me, the question is sort of, do specific bees forage on specific plants? And so is there enough to go around, because different bees are foraging different things?
Right. And in an urban landscape, that question changes quite a bit, because resource availability is patchier. The flowers that are in bloom are not always going to be attractive to bees, especially, pardon me, if there's a lot of ornamental gardening going on. So yes, absolutely, different bees like different flowers, and not seeing honeybees on something could be an indicator of a lot of factors, right? Because they're recruitment-based foragers. So the basic, most benign answer is that the foragers that went out that day found something better somewhere else and then told everyone where it is, and that's where the bees are going. And they've just not happened on the flowers in the yard, or not seen them as a really attractive resource. They may be not as abundant, like some tried and they were like, not that great. But also, yes, the actual floral species, especially if we're talking about native plant species, sometimes have really specialized nectar, nectaries, nectar quality and quantity can be lower sugar content than honeybees are interested in. So it's not the same value proposition. So there could be lots of reasons why you're not seeing honeybees on your flowers, even if you have a honeybee hive right there.
I just like, because they're always talking about the competition between honeybees and native bees, but I'm thinking if they're sort of sourcing different plants, you know, like, are they always sourcing the same plant? And I don't think
Yeah, not necessarily, right? And that's the theory. So the theory of competition between honeybee, like with a resource overlap, would really be a bee. That's why we singled out like medium tongue length bumblebees as often selecting the same flower as a honeybee would, because their morphology, or at least their nectar, nectar drinking morphology is near identical to a honeybee. So they'd be going after the same flower because they're good at it. Whereas if you're looking at something really small, like some of the native leafcutter bees or sweat bees, they can access flowers that honeybees can't, potentially. And they may also be interested in smaller volumes of nectar that a honeybee wouldn't bother with.
Any questions in here? Anybody else have any questions? No. Okay, we're at the end of our meeting then. Thank you very much, Vicki, for your presentation. Thank you, Damian, for your apiary presentation. And thank you, Marion, as always, for your beekeeping calendar. And we hope to see you back in March for our next meeting.
Oh, thanks for having me. I always enjoy chatting. And yeah, have a good rest of your evening, everybody.
Thanks, Vicki. It was great.
Thanks, Vicki.